Turismo 7 remains one of the best looking games this generation, with its remarkably high quality materials, lighting, and visual design driving that presentation. GT7 always leaves a strong impression. But there were some limitations. The beautiful ray tracing features that we observed in replays look great, but they were limited to non-gameplay modes exclusively and at lower frame rates. Furthermore, as amazing as GT7's PSVR2 implementation is, the reliance on asynchronous time warp results in a degradation of motion clarity. Thus, when we first caught wind of the PS5 Pro being a thing, Gran Turismo 7 was one of the first games we thought of as a great candidate for the new machine. Could we potentially see in-game ray tracing? What about improved PSVR2 support, 8K support even? The potential is enormous. So what did we get? That's right, Polyphony Digital has included all of these features and more, and that's what we're going to dig into today. In typical Polyphony style, users are given a great deal of control over the presentation, allowing you to dial in settings to match your every desire. This new patch elevates an already beautiful game to the next level, so let's dig in. This is the new options menu when played on a PS5 Pro. The top settings may look familiar, but if you look down, you'll see 3 new selections as well: 8K support, VR reprojection, and PSSR. But there's more to this than just these options, and that's where I'd like to start. You see, the graphics priority setting now has more of an impact on the in-game graphics. When ray tracing and resolution is selected on the Pro, ray tracing features become available during gameplay. But these options are also influenced by another setting, which we'll get to. The key here is that the same high quality reflections that we saw back in replays can now be enjoyed in gameplay. So what does it do specifically for those visuals? Well, as before, this allows ray traced reflections to be used across every car on the track. That means self-reflections, world reflections, and reflections of other cars and lights now play realistically off the surface of every vehicle. So without ray tracing enabled, Polyphony relies on tried and true cube maps. The reflection probes do a great job capturing the environment details, and thanks to very high quality materials and the realistic simulation of light, the results are very good. Until now, this is what the series has relied on for many years. But once you add ray trace reflections into the mix, you'll begin to appreciate the added depth and realism that you get. Essentially, this means that reflections now more accurately correspond to the world around you. Everything is reflected across every car, and it behaves in a more physically accurate manner, adding to the realism. So starting with this chromed out Supra, boasting a mirror-like finish, we can toggle the ray tracing features on and off, allowing you to see the difference. Did you spot it? I think it looks very good in both cases, but if you look more carefully, you should begin to notice the improvements you get with ray tracing. Let's start with the car itself. So first, check out the tail lights reflecting on the rear bumper. The car now has proper self-reflections. You'll see this on things like side mirrors, the giant wings on the back of many cars, and everything else. It all reflects properly onto itself. Of course, secondary reflections, the reflection of the reflection, are still handled via cube maps. And unfortunately, that's also true of glass. Any transparent material, such as window glass, still relies on cube maps as well. This was the case with the replays in the original version as well, by the way. In addition, the environment reflection is now generated via ray tracing, which has some benefits. Firstly, the reflection is now more closely rooted in the actual track design, and secondly, the actual update rate is improved in many scenarios. What do I mean? Well, check out this view using a Formula 1 racer. When using cube maps, the update rate of the reflection itself is lower than the actual game's frame rate. As trees whoosh past the car, it doesn't look as smooth as it should, does it? Well, with ray tracing enabled, this problem is eliminated. The reflection updates at the same frame rate as the rest of the visuals. The movement of the trees across the car surface is just a lot smoother with ray tracing enabled, right? You also get the added benefit of proper dynamic reflections from cars as well as self-reflections, like this off-screen area reflecting onto the driver's helmet. That said, This also kinda highlights one limitation of the ray tracing in GT7. Essentially, to remain performant, trees rendered into the game's BVH structure are simplified and somewhat blocky. I pointed this out in my original GT7 video, by the way, and it's the same here, so trees don't really look great in the reflection. However, I still think the overall effect is much superior to relying on cube maps. What I really like though is how you can see your car reflected in the rear of cars in front of you while driving. Like in this scene, pulling up behind this Clio, you can see the car that I'm driving properly reflected on the rear hatch of the Clio. You can also see the reflection of this Clio across the hood of my car. The effect of seeing other cars reflected properly onto one another cannot be understated. It's very immersive and better ties everything together. This is without a doubt the best example of ray traced reflections we've ever seen in a racing game. In addition, every reflection is now unique to each car. You see, the cube map probes are limited in that they often show the same reflection across nearby cars, since they're generated from a single reflection probe. You can still, unfortunately, observe this phenomenon in action if you look at the rear glass of a car when passing below an underpass, since of course glass does not use RT reflections. However, it means that the rest of the car, the body reflections, are a lot more accurate now across the entire pack of cars. But there's another interesting thing to consider here, the roughness cutoff, and this is where GT7 has a huge advantage over other similar games. Essentially, rough reflections require more power to render, and as such, the cutoff used in competing racing games means that only the glossiest of surfaces actually receive reflections. With GT7, that is not the case. Very rough materials can also show reflections. Take for instance the hood of this car. It's supposed to be a rough matte material, right? But with cube maps enabled, you don't get that effect at all due to how cube maps work. With ray tracing, the roughness is preserved, however, and the reflections in the middle of the hood appear distinct compared to the glossy paint around it. You can also see this in the external view when driving past matte painted cars like this one here. You can see the reflection despite the matte paint. But where it helps the most is arguably the interiors. Here we have a sea of plastics, metals, wood, and cloth all jammed together depending on the car. Since Gran Turismo supports both diffuse and glossy reflections at the same time, the realism is massively boosted. Note how the specular glow of the rasterized lighting is correctly eliminated when using RT, and how all the other surfaces around the car properly reflect the things around them. The cockpits still look very good without ray tracing, let's be clear, but the RT adds an extra bit of realism that was otherwise missing. Plus, when you drive through a tunnel like this, the lights you see in ray traced mode correspond to the actual lights in the scene more accurately, and the update appears a lot more realistic. One of my favorites though is with this BMW Z8. Ignoring the fact that we have the top down yet the interior remains dry, check out the windshield wipers. With ray tracing enabled, they actually reflect on the glossy dashboard material properly as they would in real life. It may seem a little subtle at first, but all of this adds up to something that looks a lot more realistic and properly utilizes the material properties built for this game's car selection. The interior shot though is interesting because this also reveals something about our next topic, PSSR. Thus far, PSSR has become somewhat controversial in that the results have not been universally positive. It looks good in some games, not so much in others. So how does it fare in Gran Turismo 7? Well, for starters, it's important to note that GT7 does not limit you to PSSR. You can enable or disable this feature. When PSSR is enabled, scenes can render as low as 1080p with PSSR being used to reconstruct up to 4K. Without it, the resolution tends to be higher, targeting native 4K instead, just like the original. Now, here's the kicker. You can enable in-game ray tracing both with the native TAA mode or with PSSR, but the cockpit ray tracing features are only available when PSSR is selected. If you disable PSSR, ray tracing is applied to every other view except the cockpit. I suspect, given the variety of materials and the amount of detail going on, that the cockpit view is just overly demanding to render in native resolution. Well, at first glance, I would say that overall, PSSR produces good results, but the results I would say are worse than the default 4K TAA used in the original game. There are a few minor issues to mention. Firstly, thin objects can exhibit additional shimmering and noise, which is always distracting. And furthermore, specific scenarios can cause visual artifacts, such as here using this beautiful Supra. With RT engaged plus PSSR, take a look at the taillights. PSSR cannot quite resolve this properly, and you end up with noisy, flickery results in this area of the image. Not great, is it? But thankfully, in most circumstances, I'd still say it looks very good. It's certainly one of the better PSSR implementations we've seen yet. As for whether you'll want to use it or not, it kind of depends on whether you're interested in the cockpit mode with ray tracing or not. Or perhaps own an 8K display. You see, that's another feature that made the cut. GT7 supports 8K, but this mode requires PSSR as it basically has to reconstruct up from a lower resolution to 8K. Pixel count suggests that we're looking at a native 4K here, which then uses PSSR to upscale all the way to 8K. So yeah, the PS5 Pro is not doing native 8K 60 in Gran Turismo 7, but it still seems to produce a nice looking image on an 8K TV. Alas, we've not managed to directly capture from the PS5 Pro in 8K mode, rather we're relying on the system's built-in recording function, so video quality does suffer a bit here. But still, it gives you the general idea. I can't imagine this being especially useful for most users, but it's very much in line with Polyphony's prior games, such as the 1080i support on PlayStation 2 or 1080p support on PlayStation 3. Now, if we circle back to the performance preferences, the frame rate option is somewhat self-explanatory. It removes ray tracing, reduces resolution, and targets the highest frame rate, so it is the smoothest way to play the game, but it's mostly relegated to the 120Hz option, which is something we'll talk about very shortly. But before we move on, let me quickly sum up my thoughts on the features we've covered thus far and which options I suggest using. So I think ray tracing is a pretty big deal in this game, and it definitely elevates the presentation to the next level. With RT enabled on the Pro, you get both RT in gameplay and 60 FPS replays with ray tracing. It's a huge deal, and I think it basically delivers exactly what I had originally wanted to see from the game when I first covered it. PSSR, on the other hand, is good in this game, better than many other games, mind you, but I still think the higher resolution TAA option looks best. Since I don't use the cockpit view in non-VR racing, losing RT in that view is not an issue, so I recommend sticking with the original non-PSSR mode. But that doesn't mean I don't enjoy the cockpit. It's absolutely crucial when used in VR. In fact, it's your only option. Alright, so as I covered back at release, GT7 was, and still is, basically the killer app for PSVR2. Even today, it's so good that I still believe a good steering wheel PSVR2 setup is worth shelling out for if you're seriously into racing games. It's the kind of dream experience that I've always wanted to see from a home console. I didn't really expect Polyphony to upgrade the PSVR2 mode for the PS5 Pro. It wasn't discussed in any significant capacity, but when you drop into the options menu, you'll find this option pertaining to it. The game doesn't even really explain what it does, other than noting that you may encounter some visual anomalies and it makes the racing feel more realistic. But upon inspection, it turned out to be one of the best features of this patch. It takes GT7 to the next level in VR by basically solving my number one issue with the original version, motion clarity. So here's the deal. On a base PS5, GT7 runs at 60 FPS in VR, but using asynchronous time warp. The player's head movement is basically interpolated up to a higher frame rate, so looking around feels very smooth, but everything else in the game world updates at just a half rate. I can't really show it here since it's not visible in the capture, but to give you an idea, you get this double image effect on all 3D elements, exactly like running a 60 FPS game within a 120Hz container on a CRT or any other low persistence display. On PS5 Pro, this new reprojection option, however, fixes this entirely. It's instantly noticeable. Motion is now ultra crisp, the double image effect is gone, and nearly all remaining blur is addressed fully. The difference in clarity is profound. Plus, actual image quality seems higher too. It's sharper and feels more detailed to the eye. So, how did they do it? Well, it turns out what we're looking at is effectively Sony's take on asynchronous space warp. No, this is not science fiction. You see, unlike time warp, space warp applies to animation, camera, and head translation. Think of it like frame generation but geared towards VR. The game generates new frames based on prediction. There's no real information on how they're even doing it, mind you. Are they leveraging machine learning? Is it even possible on a base PS5? None of this is clear, but what is clear are the graphics. It works exceptionally well, with only a couple minor caveats. So, firstly, this mode can interfere with HUD elements, causing distortion on text, depending on what's happening in the scene. Secondly, when objects pass behind transparent surfaces, like the fences here in Watkins Glen, you end up with some other visual anomalies. However, if I'm honest, for my taste, these are ultimately not important compared to the massive boost in quality. It's just an unbelievable lift in motion clarity, and it really got me back into playing this game in PSVR2. That, however, covers off most of the improvements introduced in this new patch, which leads us on to the next part of this video, performance. The number of permutations on offer here is massive, and the settings can have a profound impact on both performance and image quality. On the face of it, there's basically two target frame rate options this time, 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, but there's caveats to each based on your settings. So when playing with ray tracing enabled or utilizing the 8K mode, the game will output at 60 Hz max, with a frame rate of 60 frames per second. During normal gameplay, 60 FPS is achieved at nearly all times, whether you have ray tracing enabled or not. Furthermore, even the game's 8K 60 mode manages to hold 60 FPS most of the time. But this is not too surprising given that it seems to be upsampling from around 4K resolution, suggesting that they're doing a 4K to 8K reconstruction, which honestly is pretty impressive. But of course, I wanted to push the performance a little harder and find areas where I could drop the frame rate. And I found one. Essentially, I created a replay featuring a grid of cars in the rain. It's a very heavy scene, which is just enough to tip over the frame rate bucket, but only with specific settings. You see, if you enable ray tracing but disable PSSR, which runs the game at 4K, I was able to drop the frame rate here on this track, just like this. So in this case, using PSSR actually produces faster performance overall. The 8K mode, however, struggles to lock to 60 in this rainy race even when using gameplay views. You can see here that it dips into the 50s both using the chase and cockpit views. Thankfully, with VRR enabled, you're well within the window, making this very acceptable if you're using an 8K screen, and I imagine most 8K screens, if not all, support VRR. The real issue crops up with the replays. These are also bumped up to a maximum of 60 frames per second, but they can be more variable overall. The game does a pretty good job of delivering a smooth replay experience even with the cinematic angles, under normal circumstances. But the rainy track once again brings the boom, dropping the frame rate significantly, and also revealing a gulf in performance between PSSR and native 4K, specifically when using ray tracing. As you can see, PSSR runs the game on average 10 to 15 frames per second faster. The 8K mode runs the game similarly to the native 4K mode. Given the cost of PSSR and the base resolution from which it's sampling, I'm surprised it's not lower. That said, the cinematic angles take a serious hit on performance. Now, I wanted to highlight this performance gulf between PSSR and native resolution specifically because as we shift over to the 120 frames per second mode, we see an interesting situation appear. When you enable 120 Hz, ray tracing is disabled entirely, no matter your settings, and in most races, you'll get a full 120 frames per second experience using both modes. And it's extremely smooth. It plays great this way and it looks pretty nice still. VRR smooths out any potential dips as well, and from a gameplay perspective, it's clearly the way to go. Sure, you give up ray tracing, but it plays so well at 120 frames per second. But what about the rainy track? Well, this one's not too bad in gameplay angles, but the replays reveal interesting results. Notice something? In this instance, the native resolution side runs the game faster than PSSR. What this says to me is that without ray tracing enabled, the bottleneck shifts to PSSR, which has a roughly 2 millisecond cost per frame. Thus, with the extra GPU resources freed up through disabling ray tracing, PSSR actually becomes more expensive when targeting these higher frame rates. Thus, if you're using the 120Hz mode, I actually recommend disabling PSSR entirely. But wait, there's one caveat. When using the game's quality mode at 4K 120, PSSR is actually slightly faster than the TAA mode, and only when watching replays using the TV camera. In every other scenario, PSSR is actually slower when using the 4K 120 mode, so it's kind of an unexpected weird little twist to this whole saga, I think. It may simply come down to the resolution itself. You see, the performance mode does seem to drop the resolution. I counted 1800p in several shots, whereas the prioritize resolution / quality mode aims for native 4K. It is worth mentioning that the Performance Pro mode in 120Hz is definitely upgraded from the base system, which dropped the resolution all the way to 1080p. Either way, I thought the results were pretty interesting in this case. But as I noted before, in every other scenario, the native resolution mode is faster than PSSR when outputting 120Hz, which obviously is going to be most important during gameplay, where that extra performance actually matters, and here native resolution always seems to have the advantage. But with that though, I think we have a pretty good overview of what this new patch brings to Gran Turismo 7 on the PS5 Pro. Of all the patches we've tested thus far, GT7 is arguably one of the very best. The extra ray tracing features, new image quality options, higher performance, VR improvements, and even things like 8K support all impress. On the surface, it goes against what Mark Cerny talked about during the presentation for the Pro. You see, rather than simplifying the quality and performance options, Polyphony instead added a whole lot more of them. But in this case, I think it was the right move, as this level of granularity fits right in with the ethos driving the Gran Turismo series. That, however, brings us to the end of this video. Be sure to let us know how you felt about YouTube's HDR experience, and perhaps we'll deliver even more HDR in the future. It's been a while since I made a video in HDR, and I couldn't think of a game better than Gran Turismo 7 to bring it back. So, we'll see you next time.